Okay, today we're going to be covering the Dynasty of Jeroboam. That dynasty is only two kings in that dynasty, and that's going to be kind of a continuing trend in the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you haven't been in this class before, we're looking at the divided kingdom, the time period after the death of Solomon, all the way up into the destruction of Jerusalem. We didn't really pay much attention to Jeroboam in our study of Rehoboam. But of course, in the days of Solomon, when Solomon's wives had all turned his heart from the Lord and Solomon had now given himself over to the worship of idols, God said that He was going to be taking away the majority of the kingdom from the son of David. And He was going to give it to one that He chose. Jeroboam was a commander under Solomon, a trustworthy commander. However, he rebelled. And the reason for his rebellion, 1 Kings chapter 11 tells us, is because Ahijah the prophet had told Jeroboam that God was taking away 10 of the tribes from the family of David and was going to be giving those to Jeroboam. Significantly, and I want us to keep this promise in mind in what we read about Jeroboam in our study today. But as Ahijah is making God's will known to Jeroboam, he says to Jeroboam that I will take you and you shall reign over whatever you desire and you shall be king over Israel. Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Now, this is not the same promise that God had made to David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is not a promise of the Messiah coming through Jeroboam and that Messiah would always reign over God's people. But there are some similarities here. The idea of an enduring house. The idea that God would firmly establish Jeroboam and his family over Israel is in this promise. But it is a promise that will not be fulfilled. And will not be fulfilled because of Jeroboam's unfaithfulness. So let's go ahead and turn over to 1 Kings chapter 12. And we're going to look at this section probably in more depth than any other section that we will in the Scripture. The beginning of 1 Kings chapter 12, we're going to look at Jeroboam's failure. Why it is that his house is not established as an enduring house. Now, what I also want to kind of do is look at this passage and showing what I think are some things that Jeroboam tried to do, measures he took in his own power to make God's will come about, to make this promise come about. And a lot of what Jeroboam does is he tries to steep his reign in the history of Israel. So the very first thing that it talks about in verse 25, Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. Now I'll give you a map here. And I can't do this on the side ones, but just on the center one here, of course, Shechem is right here. It's in the heart of Israel. Penuel, however, is on the eastern side of the Jordan River. This is where the tribe of Gad and the half tribe of Reuben, they would have territory over here. Now, these sites have significance. What had happened at Penuel? Sorry? Okay, that is where when Jacob is making his way back from the house of Laban and he is about to meet Esau, he wrestles with the Lord at Penuel. Now, Shechem has a lot of history. We even talked about that when we were looking at how Rehoboam had gone to Shechem and there he was going to be anointed as king. Shechem is the first site in Canaan that God brought Abram to, where He promised to Abram, I will give you all this land. Shechem is also in Joshua chapter 18. We read about how the tribes go to Shechem and there they repeat or renew the covenant with God. Shechem also has some significance in the life of Jacob. Shechem is really the first stop in Canaan, in the Promised Land, after Jacob returned from Laban's house. And of course it is there that Jacob's family kills all the male inhabitants, and Jacob becomes afraid for his own life because now all the people in the lands are going to hate him. But these are two sites with some fairly rich significance in the history of God's people. So these are his capitals. And you could also see some political savvy as to why Jeroboam would choose these sites, having one capital on the western side of the Jordan River, having a second capital on the eastern side of the Jordan River, having a connection with the tribes on both sides. There's probably some ideas there as well. But of course, you go further. Now, think of this, and remember again the promise that God had made to Jeroboam back in chapter 11, verses 37 and 38. Jeroboam said in his heart, verse 26 of chapter 12, "Now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah." What does Jeroboam not have? He has no faith. We always have to remember, faith is not just a New Testament concept. Faith is very much an Old Testament concept. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 2 that the promises that God had made Israel in the Old Testament, the word that they had received, the gospel they received, profited them nothing because it was not combined with faith. Well, here's yet another example. Jeroboam had been made a promise by God. Follow me. Keep my commandments. Keep my covenant. I will establish for you an enduring house. I'll do this. And what's the first thing Jeroboam thinks of when he's king? Oh, they're going to rebel against me. And if they start going back to Jerusalem, they're going to leave me. And they'll all go back to Rehoboam. There's no thought that God can establish His kingdom if He'll just follow. So what he devises to do, and significantly, and so there's going to be a lot of connection with Aaron in this. So I kind of want to ask you, if you've read that account anytime recently, Exodus 32, why is it that Aaron produces the golden calf in the first place? The people ask him. Okay, so what do you read in verse 28? So the king consulted. Now this isn't exactly the same. It's not all the people coming to Jeroboam and requesting that he make a golden calf. But you've got the input of others here. I don't know who Jeroboam consulted, but he's asking others and saying, hey, I'm worried my people are going to go back to Judah. What can we do? And out of that consultation comes the idea, okay, we're going to make golden calves. Now, he clearly has the encounter in Exodus chapter 32 in mind. How do we know that? How do we know that what Jeroboam is doing has connection with what Aaron did in Exodus 32? Yeah. What he says is what Aaron had said. It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. He didn't say that because Aaron wasn't talking about Jerusalem. But he says, behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now, I don't fully understand why he would want to make this connection with Aaron, because how did that work out for Aaron? It didn't work out so well. That was not a good thing in the history of God's people. But he uses the same thing that Aaron has said. Okay? Now, there's also the idea, and we won't figure this out for sure. There are some who postulate that the calves were not supposed to be actual representations of God. They were only supposed to be the kind of the pillars that the God would stand on or hover over, something like that, like the Ark of the Covenant where God's presence was. How much of this was based on Egyptian idolatry? Bulls were certainly also significant in Canaanite idolatry as well. But you can't get around the fact that Jeroboam is clearly violating the first two commandments. Whether he's promoting worship of another god, which doesn't necessarily seem to be what he's doing here. I think he's still trying to promote the worship of Jehovah God. But he's doing so by making a representation of Jehovah God. In the first two commandments, they forbid this. They prohibit this. Okay, so he copies Aaron's golden calves. The sites that he chooses, these are also sites that have significant religious history. So let's go back to our map one more time. Here is Shechem. This is where probably Jeroboam's main capital is. Jerusalem is down in this area here. Bethel is not far to the north of Jerusalem. And Bethel is going to be right there on the border between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, what significance does Bethel have in our Old Testament history? Jacob's ladder. Okay, so as Jacob is fleeing from his brother Esau, first place he goes, camps overnight, has nothing, and yet God appears to him and he sees this vision of a ladder stretching from heaven to earth, angels ascending and descending on it. And Jacob knows, the Lord has appeared to me, and the Lord makes promises to him there in is it Genesis 28, I believe. He renames the place Bethel, house of God. So Bethel has significant Old Testament history. Now Dan's a little trickier. Now, first off, anybody remember, why is Dan all the way up here? This is even kind of stretching the borders of Israelite territory in their history. Dan is really the furthest point north you're going to go in the kingdom of Israel, or can go in the kingdom of Israel. Now, if you recall, that is not where Dan's territory was supposed to be. But Dan moves there in the time of the judges. The tribe of Dan moves there because they're not able to drive out the Canaanites. Again, lack of faith in God, lack of trust in God. So they relocate to this far north area. And significantly in that, when they do this, they bring along a Levite who it is believed, you have to, depending on which manuscript you're going with, is a grandson of Moses. And they bring along this Levite, and this Levite is going to be their priest. So Jeroboam in some ways trying to do what Dan did back in the days of the judges. We're going to institute a new religion, or at least innovative practices in our religion, and we're going to do this with different priests than what God would have commanded. And by the way, they've done a lot of excavation in the area of Dan. This is that altar kind of complex in Dan that they've unearthed. So certainly we don't have the golden calf still there. But this is the area in Dan anyway, that was set up in the days of Jeroboam where Israel would go and they would sin against the Lord. I know Katie Owen is actually over in Palestine right now, so I don't know if they're going up to Dan, but she may be seeing that this week. We'll find out. Okay, so back to Jeroboam and what he's trying to do. He rejects the Levites. Verse 31, he made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Now, what might be motivation for Jeroboam to use other people as priests? I kind of have it on there already. And you go back to Exodus chapter 32. Who was it that stood with Moses? It was the Levites. Well, Aaron knows that the Levites who were entrusted with caring for the temple and also instrumental in the work of the temple, Levites aren't going to go along with this. They're not going to like this. So, we'll make other priests. We'll spread the priesthood around to others. Now, that has ramifications for what will happen in Israel. You have valuable teaching sources that are not going to be utilized because one of the functions of the priests and Levites too is also to help in instructing in the ways of God. But we also looked at in the days of Rehoboam, what was the result of Jeroboam's changes here in 2 Chronicles 11? What did all those Levites and others who feared Jehovah, what did they do? They moved south. Doing the very thing, by the way, that Jeroboam was worried about. Oh, the people are going to leave. Well, not all the people left, but those who were faithful to the Lord, they did leave. They went south. They moved to Judah. So he rejected the Levites, and then he made himself a new Aaron. He made himself a high priest. You see that in the text here. For instance, in verse 33. He, that is Jeroboam, went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 18th month. Later on in chapter 13 and verse 1, when this prophet is going to come against Jeroboam and to tell him the judgment of God against Jeroboam's false worship, it talks about that Jeroboam was standing by the altar to burn incense. So Jeroboam has made himself priest, and I think probably made himself high priest. Name of his sons. Who are the two sons of Aaron that we know their names, or at least remember their names quite easily? From Leviticus 10. Nadab and Abihu. What's the son that reigns after Jeroboam? Nadab. The son that dies, Abijah. Not exactly Abihu, but the names are very similar linguistically and in their meaning. So possibly Jeroboam is even naming his sons based on, well, these are the sons of Aaron. Nadab and Abihu, Nadab and Abijah. And then again, much like Aaron, you remember back in Exodus chapter 32, as soon as the golden calf was constructed, Aaron saw this. He built an altar before it. This is verse 5 of Exodus chapter 32. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." So the next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Now, I think that's part of this. The other part is that Jeroboam is looking at an authorized feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, but he changes the month. But again, it's all in connection with this making of this idol, making of this object of worship that Aaron had made. So Jeroboam does all these things. And I think a lot of these things has to do with, I'll establish my rule, I'll establish my reign, make all these connections to religious things that have happened in our history, of significant figures and people in our history, and that will engender the loyalty of the people, and they'll follow me. But of course, the most significant thing that you read in this whole section is what is said in verse 30. This thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. You skip over in chapter 13 in verse 34 and why judgment was coming upon Jeroboam's house. It says, this event became sin to the house of Jeroboam, even to blot it out and destroy it from the face of the earth. Now skip over to 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 17, chapter where we read about Assyria coming, taking the northern kingdom of Israel captive. And look at God's complaint against this northern kingdom in verse 21. Now he had torn Israel from the house of David. They made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. 200 years in the future, when Israel is taken captive, and God, in saying why this happened, goes right back to what we just read about in 1 Kings chapter 12. This thing became a sin. All right. That's the majority of what we're going to talk about was in this section. We're going to look at the other sections as well. But any other questions, comments, anything you noticed in the text you wanted to discuss, I've more or less gone through what I wanted to say this morning, on that part anyway. All right, I clearly explained it thoroughly. I'm good. No, seriously. Okay. Then we're going to move on, because what we are going to look at are three judgments that God makes in the rest of our time spent on Jeroboam. The first judgment is against his false worship. And that's in the 13th chapter. God uses a man of God, a prophet. Significantly, God used a prophet, Ahijah, back in chapter 11, to tell Jeroboam that he was going to be king, and that if he would follow God, that his house would be established and would endure. Now God is using another prophet to condemn the false worship that Jeroboam had instituted. Now, the first condemnation is not one that's going to happen immediately. What's the first judgment that the prophet, the man of God, says against the altar there in chapter 13? Someone's going to desecrate that altar. Someone's going to burn human bones on that altar. Who's that going to be? Josiah. That's more than 200 years in the future. Okay? So there's one thing to go up and say, okay, in the distant future, a son of David, Josiah by name, he is going to absolutely desecrate this altar. Okay. None of us are going to be alive. But then the man of God says, and here's a sign. Here's a sign of God's judgment on all this. The altar is going to split in half. The ashes are going to fall out. The ashes that are burned, given to God, they're going to fall to the earth. Now, Jeroboam doesn't take too kindly to this. He says, seize them. And then, Jeroboam's hand withers. And I think it's significant. He has to ask the prophet, you beseech God on my behalf. Why is Jeroboam supposedly making all these sacrifices on this altar in the first place? To get God's favor, right? Isn't that why they made sacrifices? To be in a right relationship with God? So Jeroboam is supposedly offering incense to God, burning sacrifices on this altar to have peace with God. But he understands here, the only way I'm getting my hand restored is if this man of God beseeches God. Should have understood at that point, what I'm doing is not bringing about God's favor. It's not happening. Well, his hand is restored. And to kind of set the stage for our next encounter, the king says to the man in verse 7, come home with me and refresh yourself, and I'll give you a reward. I don't think this is Jeroboam just offering the hospitality that would have been customary in the ancient Near East. More likely, this is Jeroboam trying to bribe the man of God, for lack of a better term. I'll give you a reward. You come with me. You and I will establish peaceful relations. And maybe then I'll have more peaceful relations with God. You come home with me, I'll give you a reward. And of course, what does the man of God say? Why can't he do it? Yeah, God said, no, don't do that. Don't eat while you're there. Don't drink while you're there. Don't even go home the same way that you went. So you can't do any of that. Now, just to skip ahead, one of the many times we'll see in this class, God's judgment's pronounced. Jeroboam has a chance to change course here, to go back, because at this point, judgment is not made against the house of Jeroboam. It's made against his false worship. But judgment isn't made against his house yet. But later in the chapter, the text simply says, after this event, Jeroboam did not return from his evil way. Again, he made priests of the high places from among all the people, any who would. He ordained to be priests of the high places, and this event became sin to the house of Jeroboam, even to blot it out and destroy it from the face of the earth. So here was an opportunity to change course, to repent, to turn back to God, and it was an opportunity squandered. All right, next section, though. I'll get your thought on this. First reading, I think all of us probably have some sympathy for the man of God. Wow. He was told by another prophet, come to my house. God has said this is okay. You can come to my house. And this man of God is going to die for this. Why do you think this episode is here? Why do we need this encounter recorded? So if you haven't read it yet, just paraphrase. Here, this man of God who's gone to Jeroboam. Jeroboam has invited him home and said, you come to my house. The man of God says, no, I can't do that. God said, don't. And he doesn't. But then there's an older prophet who hears about this man of God, hears about what he's said and done there at Bethel. And he sends word and says, well, you come to my house. Actually, he goes to him himself. And the man of God said, I can't do this. God said, don't do this. And the older prophet said, what? But God has told me, you can come home with me. And even while the man of God is with this older prophet, God then reveals through the older prophet that his man of God, the one who had gone and proclaimed judgment on the altar at Bethel, he would die. And he does. He's killed by a lion, and to show that this is from the hand of God, his body is on the road, and his donkey is standing beside the body, and the lion is standing beside the body, and they're just standing there. So that's the paraphrase of that whole section. And again, you read it, you probably have a little sympathy for the man of God. Like, wow. He thought he was doing what God wanted him to. So why is this here? Yes, absolutely. Listen to God. Now, yeah, good, Steve.
I think it mirrors what Jeroboam is doing. God told Jeroboam personally what he expected. And Jeroboam then goes and tells the people a lie. And it's ultimately going to result in their demise. And God had told this man. It's kind of like later revelations of people who claim that they had the experience with Jesus and he taught them. But God is coming.
Yeah.
And that's the end of it. The other question I have, or one of the ways that I kind of fit this in my system, is all the righteous priests and Levites evidently had fled.
Yeah.
This little prophet being there, it must not bother him what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I think that's significant too. Now, it could be, given that Bethel is right there on the border, maybe he didn't feel the need, but he's also right there in the heart of it. This is where the false worship is happening. It's in Bethel. So he's referred to as a prophet. I think there's maybe some significance. God's prophet in this passage is referred to as man of God. The older prophet simply referred to as prophet. And maybe God is making a distinction here. One's a real prophet, the other one's not, never was. So we don't know for sure. But to get to this point too, when the man of God went to Jeroboam and has this proclamation from God, what else did he have? He had a sign to back up the proclamation. God is giving a message to Jeroboam. What you're doing is wrong, and terrible things are going to happen to this altar in the future. And so you know that this is from God. Here's a sign. Your altar is going to split apart, and the ashes are going to fall to the ground. What did the man of God not ask the older prophet? How do I know your message is from God? I think what this whole section is doing, showing the importance of the prophets, showing the importance of how even God's people need to rely only on what they knew came from God. And so even this man of God who conscientiously is trying to do the right thing, yet he did not make sure what he was doing came from God. And that's going to be so vitally important in the divided kingdom in this time. They're going to be tempted to depart from God. Their rulers are going to be departing from God. Their kings are going to be saying, oh, it's okay to worship God in this way. The people themselves need to understand, no, we need to only do what we know comes from God. And that's going to be ultimately the downfall of all of God's people, whether it be in the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom. All right, any other thoughts or comments on that? Yes. Yes. Absolutely. That's one of the takeaways. I don't even know if we'd have time to get to it. But lesson we need to take from this, we have one source of what we know came from God. And it's God's Word revealed through His Son, His apostles and prophets. Everything else, how I feel about it, how some modern day prophet, what he says about it, you cannot and will not know that comes from God. You know Scripture came from God. That's what we're supposed to be guided by. All right, our discussion today is going to conclude with God's judgment against Jeroboam's house. And we're not going to take a lot of time on this one. The events are driven by the fact that Jeroboam's son Abijah is sick. And so he sends his wife in disguise, and interestingly, sends his wife to Ahijah. Now, that's one of those many places. Okay, wait, Abijah, Ahijah, which is which? Welcome to the divided kingdom. Wait till we get to the family of Ahab ruling kind of in both Israel and Judah and keeping those kings situated. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, so Abijah is the child that's sick. Jeroboam sends his wife to Ahijah. Ahijah was the prophet who told Jeroboam back in chapter 11, God's going to make you king. And if you will follow God, if you'll be faithful to the covenant with God, God's going to set up your house as an enduring house, just as He had done for David. Sends his wife with gifts, perhaps treating the prophet of God like the Canaanites would have treated their seers and their prophets. Take enough gift, take enough good things, give it to the prophet, give it to the seer, and maybe that seer is going to give you a good report. Well, Ahijah is not deceived because the Lord gives him exactly the information of what's happening. And here's the message to Jeroboam beginning in verse 7. Because I exalted you from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you, yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all of his heart, to do only that which was right in my sight. You also have done more evil than all who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger and cast me behind your back. Therefore, behold, I will bring calamity on the house of Jeroboam. It will cut off from Jeroboam every male person, both bond and free, in Israel. And I'll make a clean sweep of the house of Jeroboam, as one sweeps away dung until it is all gone. Goes on to talk about how Jeroboam's house and all who are going to die from that house, those who die in the city are going to be eaten by the dogs. Those who die in the fields are going to be eaten by the birds. This is devastation. This is dishonor even given to the house of Jeroboam. Later on in verse 15, Ahijah says, the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. And I think what God is doing here is showing here the long-term ramifications of what's happening in the kingdom. It's not just going to be that Jeroboam's house, his dynasty, is going to come to an end. And that was going to happen rather quickly. We won't even take time to go over to chapter 15. You read about Nadab's reign. There's not a lot that's said about Nadab's reign, but ultimately his family is all put to death. A new dynasty emerges in Israel. But God said of Israel, they're going to be like a reed shaken in the water. Absolutely unstable. No depth, no roots. Just shaking in the wind here. Well, that is Israel. That is Israel for the majority of their time as a kingdom. And Brother Steve will be taking you through your lesson Wednesday night. And I just call that unstable kingdoms. That's what Israel is. You're going to have in about a 40-year span. Now, this may not seem like anything to us because we have elected officials. But you look at a kingdom. I mean, how long has Elizabeth been queen in England? Is this the 75 years, something like that? Okay. Granted, most kings or queens don't necessarily rule that long, but it's a long time. 40-year span, you're going to have 5 kings in Israel. 4 different dynasties. That's instability. That is a reed shaken in the water. And God points it all back to, it's because you left me. It's because you left and served other gods, made molten images. Not only is Jeroboam's house not established, but Israel will suffer the consequences for years and years to come until ultimately Israel is taken away captive. All right. Any other questions, comments as we wrap up our study of Jeroboam's dynasty this morning? Steve?
This passage reminds me where it says that David followed God with all his heart. 1 Kings 11 says Solomon's heart was turned from God and no longer loyal to him. And now we see the ultimate in the 14th chapter where it says Jeroboam cast the Lord behind him.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What imagery? Just, no, we're not. And go back to what we read at the beginning, chapter 11, verses 37, 38. God is saying, just follow me. I'm going to provide. No, get rid of you. Jeroboam takes everything in his own hands, try to establish his dynasty. Does not work. And that's my other takeaway. If you've already read the material, you've already seen that. If you trust in God's promises, then you're not going to be worried about what could happen. And that's what Jeroboam was worried about. Oh, well, people go back to Jerusalem. They're gonna leave me. Get worried about what could happen in the future. If Jeroboam had just been worried about, am I following God? Am I keeping the covenant? All the other worries and cares would have been taken care of. But he didn't. All right. Thank you, everybody. Again, you'll continue this. You're going to look at About 40 years and looking at some things that happen in both kingdoms this coming Wednesday night. You're going to be looking at some things that happen in the southern kingdom of Judah, as well as those 5 kings and 4 dynasties in the northern kingdom of Israel. And then next Lord's Day, you're going to look at how in Israel there was some political stability. Ahab's rule lasts for significantly longer than most of these Israelite kings would last. But even though there was some political stability at that time, there certainly is greater issues that are happening in the northern kingdom of Israel. All right, thank you, everybody.